Russia, today and tomorrow. And our presenter has a most unique perspective and background relative to the topic. Oleg Kalugin is the son of a KGB officer, but going back before it was the KGB, and grew up wanting very much to have a professional career in the service of foreign intelligence for his country. He went to Leningrad State University, was recruited into the foreign intelligence part of the KGB, came to the United States as a Fulbright scholar, studied journalism at Columbia, has a degree from Columbia. I was mentioning that Professor Faust is here, who asked him a question, whose PhD is in physics there, but they're both graduates of Columbia. He then was a journalist assigned to the United Nations, was there for 5 years, and came to Washington as the deputy head in 1965, right quickly after leaving the UN, and was there until 1970. And during that time, he ended up being the head of the activity here in the United States. 1970, back with the KGB headquarters, he was first a deputy head of foreign intelligence worldwide, and in 1973 became head of Soviet counterintelligence worldwide. He was given the rank of general in the KGB, the youngest man ever to get that position, and so by the age of 40, he had moved along very, very well within that institution. As I said, had the rank of general, later became major general, and was heading up that very important part of foreign intelligence, which he continued to be in until 1980. And he could tell better than others the sequence of events after that, of course. There were some criticisms which he made of the KGB even during that period of time, some hints at favoritism and other flaws. But in 1980, he left that particular assignment, was moved into domestic intelligence in Leningrad primarily, and had responsibilities not as interesting perhaps as the foreign intelligence responsibilities. And I should add parenthetically, if you read the various things that he was involved in foreign intelligence, you'll love it. Huge spy cases that all of us are familiar with were under his aegis to a large extent, and interesting and constructive time from the standpoint of his responsibilities then. But disagreements during the 80s were very clear. He was a critic of KGB internal intelligence relative to the public, at the same time that others were benefiting, and very many members of the Communist Party benefiting personally. So he became an outspoken critic during the 1980s, left the KGB. He was elected as a delegate to the Supreme Soviet, and was a critic, continued as a critic there. He later was helpful to Mr. Gorbachev in his survival. He was a supporter of Mr. Yeltsin's movement, and and I will not comment at all upon the internal rivalries which existed in the 80s, which could explain the difficulties which he confronted. But in any case, he was a supporter of reform. He has been a critic of the Putin regime, and Mr. Putin has been a critic of his. Mr. Putin has called him a traitor. He's been tried in absentia for that and convicted of being a traitor. He became a United States citizen a few years ago. He's been in the United States since 1995, taught at Catholic University and elsewhere. As I say, lives here now as a citizen. I think stands, if you like the film Gorky Park, you have to romanticize about Mr. Kalugin a bit, which I must admit my fantasies have drifted in that direction as I read of his history of reform. But in any case, He's written a book about his experience in the KGB, the subtitle being 32 Years of Spying Against the Western Countries. In any case, he's here with us this evening. He's a man with a unique background and experience, currently a citizen of the United States. He's a professor at CI Center, Counterintelligence, where a number of people from FBI and CIA and other intelligence services work. He continues to contribute to a kind of a daily report, which is used by businessmen. He's well-known, articulate, speaks widely, and we're absolutely delighted to have him this evening. Mr. Kalugin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming and listen to what I say. And I'll probably start with my personal life and make some corrections. I'm sorry to say that, but this is inevitable after all. Well, it's true that my father was a KGB officer. When he retired in '55, actually, he was pushed out because he was a captain, and Khrushchev took over, and he thought the KGB was oversized, so my father was just dumped. And I graduated from high school in '52, and Joseph Stalin was still alive, and I was his greatest admirer. I mean, as millions of people across the world, we loved him. We really thought he was the greatest guy who helped Russia, led Russia in this war against the Germans, and helped Russia rebuild the devastated nation economically and otherwise. It was 1952, and when I said to my father, I want to become a KGB officer, he said, don't do it, my son. That's just a dirty work. Well, do kids ever listen to their parents? I was fixed on that idea, and I applied for a KGB job. Well, I was told, listen, you have to have some training. And I was sent for training to the Institute of Foreign Languages, which operated under the auspices of the KGB at the time in Leningrad, where I was born, St. Petersburg now. And I spent 4 years studying English and German and the tradecraft of counterintelligence. I studied the Anglo-Saxon world, its history, national economy, geography, the weaknesses and strengths of these nations. When I graduated with honors in '56, something dramatic happened. Nikita Khrushchev, in his secret speech, obtained, by the way, by the Israeli intelligence and made public later, he denounced Stalin's crimes. And when I heard, about these crimes, as millions of my countrymen and people across the world, we were shocked. We were really just terribly shocked because we did not know anything about Stalin's brutality, about his criminal character, about the millions of people who died in concentration camps or were executed. We didn't know about that. And when I listened to the BBC programs, I remember when I was a young man, and they were all jammed, I would thought this is Western propaganda. I would not take it seriously. And now Khrushchev confirmed the fact. That was something which led to my new, look at the world. And while I was in the KGB, I had the fleeting thought of just quitting this criminal organization. And yet Khrushchev said, come on, fellows, that's our painful history. Let's move forward. We'll build a new society based on justice, human rights, and economic prosperity. So I was a young man. I was a party member by that time, and I believed Khrushchev. Well, after graduation from that Institute of Foreign Languages, KGB, I was invited to Moscow to the intelligence school, where I spent 2 more years studying Arabic and the world of Islam. I was supposed to go to Cairo in 1958 after graduation from that school. And just 2 weeks before my departure for Cairo, Egypt, I was invited to the personnel department of the KGB. And the guy said, look, you don't look like an Arab. I said, no, I don't, I'm sorry. we have a better idea. Why don't you go to the United States as a Fulbright scholar? I thought, well, gladly. That's how I landed in the United States in '58, Columbia School of Journalism. And ever since, my life has been all with the United States. Actually, when I was at Columbia University, something happened. The first American of Russian background, I mean, Russian by birth. I mean, actually, his parents were Russian-born. He had access to classified information related to solid fuel missiles. At that time, solid fuel for missiles, that was something extraordinary. You know, the United States and the USSR were at this space race, for space achievements. And that man, I recruited easily. He wanted to build socialism Chinese style. His wife was Chinese. And I said, let's work for something in between, Chinese, Russian, Soviet. And that's where I obtained first classified secret information, and that propelled my career in the service. As a young man, I was not supposed to. I was a rookie in training, and now I have a source of classified information. So that led to my career. I came to the United States as a correspondent of Radio Moscow. I spent 4 years at the United Nations. I recruited a number of Americans, all sorts of people, leftists and rightists, pacifists and Russians and Jews and Afro-Americans, civil rights, world peace, and lots of problems which have been utilized by the KGB and, well, other services, obviously. And that, again, helped me in my career. But there was a defection from the KGB ranks in 1964, a guy by name Nasenko. He defected to the United States. I was recalled from the United States, and I thought I would never come back. Then again, the personnel department said, listen, why don't you go as a diplomat? You'll have a diplomatic passport. In case they catch you, they'll be expelled. That's it. Okay. So I come as a diplomat to Washington, and 5 years as deputy chief and acting chief of the KGB operations in the United States from Washington, D.C. Base, most important, obviously, at that time, and today, no change, by the way. Well, at that time, the United States was enemy number one. Today, it's priority number one, some linguistic differences, So 5 years in Washington again, some good things, but no ideology anymore. We would recruit people who wanted money and, mercenaries. And that would, but sometimes people are afraid of mercenaries. I was not afraid. People have to earn money somehow, somewhere. If they want to spy, okay, we'll provide you for the rest of your lives and your family if necessary, like Robert Hansen, who is serving life, in jail today. Well, anyway, 5 years in the United States. I'm back in Moscow. I'm promoted again and again, and I become chief of foreign counterintelligence, as correctly stated. I had 4 major missions at the time as a man in charge of 700 officers and more than 500 foreign assets. The penetration of all security and intelligence organizations of the world, number 1 mission. Number 2, the penetration of all emigre organizations, Russian, Ukrainian, Baltic states, Armenian, wherever they are, in Norway or in California, doesn't matter. Well, they may feel nostalgic about the old Soviet Union, or they may have relatives at home. There are lots of reasons why people sometimes are willing to collaborate. Well, and the third mission was to protect the Soviet citizens abroad, nearly 300,000 at that time, from diplomats to trade mission officials to merchant marine, sailors, construction engineers, and you name it, from defections to the West or from being recruited by the CIA and other friendly pro-Western services. And the final mission was a very delicate, to look for weak aims, spies inside the intelligence ranks. That is, counterintelligence within the intelligence. Very sensitive, delicate, and often ungrateful because you are an officer of the KGB and yet you have to investigate another officer. So it looks as if you're an officer first class and they are second rate. I mean, well, that was a problem. But it was okay. I mean, we managed. But what happened, and this is important for you to understand, my transition from a successful officer I had direct access to Andropov, KGB chairman at the time. But in 1978, I learned from a guy whose name is probably familiar to you, Donald McLean, one of the Soviet spies from the British Five. Donald McLean told me that my original source, that guy with the fuel program, was arrested in Moscow. As a matter of fact, he had to defect to Russia because the FBI found out through one of the defectors that he was a Soviet spy. But he was arrested in Moscow because the Soviet KGB suspected he was a CIA double agent. And this is when we face sometimes a choice in our lives, either to ignore it, after all, so what? I mean, well, thousands of people. Or you stand up and tell your superiors that this man is not a CIA spy. And I stood up, I defended that man and his good name as a result, as a punishment for my intervention of the domestic, I was in the intelligence service. Andropov gave an order to transfer me to the domestic service, Leningrad, my native city, St. Petersburg. Before I saw him last time on January 2nd of 1980, well, he said, oh, Oleg, for a year or two, don't worry, you'll be back. Well, I spent 7 years in Leningrad as number 2 man in this field office, 3,000 officers, well, including Mr. Putin, by the way, Mr. Patrushev, well, lots of other guys whose names are today in the news or in one way or another. But what really opened my eyes was the work inside the USSR. In my previous career, my targets were Westerners, foreigners. Now my targets were the people of Russia, who did not feel happy, who were disgruntled, who were disenchanted, disillusioned. They wanted a change, and my job was to look and pick them up and put them in jail or psychiatric institution. Well, on top of there were no executions, by the way, none, for political reasons. That's a fact. But to put a jail or psychiatric, that was a more humane approach to the political dissidents. And when I learned that, in my personal experience, I thought that's not the job I had been trained for, and that's not the life I want to live. And it was Mr. Gorbachev, and I paid tribute to him in a sense, that he opened a new chapter in Russian history when he publicly said to the world and to the Russian people, stop lying to the world and ourselves. Let's open our society. So I was one of the early supporters of Gorbachev. I somewhat overestimated his, let's put it this way, well, determination to proceed with reforms. And as a result of my political or public intervention into the lives of many people, Mr. Gorbachev denounced me as a traitor. By his decree, I was stripped of my rank, of my decorations, and I was supposed to be jailed, and a miracle happened. On that very day, when I was to appear at the prosecutor's office, I was nominated and registered as a candidate to the Russian Supreme Soviet. Well, that's the Russian Soviet Parliament. And that miracle, really, I was elected in a, totally in the region which Krasnodar region, some of you may know. It's in the south of Russia, on the Black Sea. Well, I was there a couple of times, but the people of Russia at that time felt so, enthusiastic. They wanted a change, and when they saw a guy from the KGB challenging his own system, they elected me, and I obtained immunity from prosecution. And that allowed me to speak even more irresponsibly against the Soviet regime. Well, as you know, in August of 1991, the old forces of the KGB tried to take revenge. They staged a coup in Moscow, and well, the Soviets, Russians, had a choice at the time. Well, I went to Russia's government house, so-called the White House. Don't confuse it with the Washington White House, Russian White House. And Yeltsin was on the tank, appealing to the people. And there's a picture of myself standing next to Yeltsin, ready to die if necessary for those, well, things we obtained, and that was my determination. Well, thank God. Well, Gorbachev, who was briefly ousted from power, came back. I was totally rehabilitated, and well, and as a member of parliament, I well, began a new life. We split the KGB into pieces. Actually, I used the American model in a country which has a history and sort of well, of centralized power. The security services in one, center were just detrimental to liberties and health of the people. So I was originally a reformer in the sense that my views to break the organization into 5 parts using the American model, CIA, FBI, NSA, Secret Service, so we did that, and that I believe is my major accomplishment, that we split the KGB at the time. Well, as you know, it did not last long. I was, as I said, totally rehabilitated. I will never forget the day, November 7th of 1991. I'm invited by President Gorbachev to the Kremlin, to the reception celebrating the anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Mr. Gorbachev apologizes. I'm so happy. It was the highest moment in my life. I did not know, and I'm not sure anyone did, that 6 weeks later there would be no USSR anymore. It just collapsed. And Mr. Yeltsin emerged as the president of Russia, independent from who, I don't know, but independent Russia, from Ukraine perhaps, or Georgia. And from that moment on, I went into private business, and I was vice president of the Russian telecommunication company. At some point in the middle of the 90s, we made a major deal with AT&T, you know, this company. And the AT&T was so impressed by the Russian, market in this area, they invited me to come to the United States for 3 years. To promote AT&T on the post-Soviet space. I did come in '95. I had no plans to stay in America. I loved America, but I love Russia more. That was my birthplace, my parents' graves, everything, my family. Well, I planned to leave as my contract expired in 95. In 95. But at that point, 98, I'm sorry, from 98 to 95 to 98, at that time, some guy who I vaguely remembered, short-sized, quiet, inconspicuous, gray, by name Volodya Putin, became chief of the Russian security services. And I heard from my friends, Oleg, he belongs to the old guard. He hates you. You better stay a little bit longer in America. Okay, I said, oh, I prolonged my contract with AT&T. And when President Putin took over, a series of political assassinations began in Russia. Yeah, well, number one was Galina Starovoytova. Well, the rest followed. Yuri Shekochin, who was poisoned by the same stuff Mr. Litvinenko would be poisoned later, polonium in London. Or say Yushchenko Sergei, who was gunned down in front of his apartment. Anna Politkovskaya, one of the most severe critics of Putin's involvement in the Chechen war, and actually, she was also killed. And well, a number of other guys. So I had some second thoughts. People told me, don't go. And Putin elected president in 2000, and he declares in one of his first, well, actually his first public interviews, he calls me traitor. And I respond publicly by calling him war criminal. And I said he will face the International Court of Justice, just like Mr. Milosevic of Yugoslavia, for what he did to Kosovo and other former republics. So, and from that moment on, well, I had no choice. That exchange left me, well, I told the public that Mr. Putin, though a lawyer formally, should have known about the presumption of innocence, one of the defining principles of, Western or civilized legal system. How could he call me a traitor without due legal process? How could he? Doesn't he know anything? Well, Mr. Putin corrected his behavior. 2 years later, I was officially charged with treason, and I was summoned to Moscow to appear in court. And I said, no, thank you. I would rather stay for a while in the United States. So I was sentenced to 15 years in jail for treason, and I had no choice at the time. And I was literally jittery, nervous, because as if you recall, in 2001, in September 11th, the United States was attacked by the Muslim extremists. And, well, President Bush looked into Mr. Putin's eyes, and he read some friendly soul, and I was nervous. I was literally nervous. What if, well, thank God, well, when I applied for political asylum, it was granted. And now I'm a happy citizen of the United States, and I'm grateful to this country for that very fact, that my life was saved, and I feel here great. Well, that's briefly the story of my life, so that you would understand what may follow. Not necessarily all in black, not at all. Ever since Mr. Putin took over as president of Russia, Russian economy has been thriving. Let me tell you, 10 years ago, the average Russian monthly salary was $80 in American currency. Today, it's 650. It's, just 10 times more. Well, Russians live today far better than they ever lived in their history. Russians have freedom to travel. This did not happen under Mr. Putin, but anyway, they are free to travel. Well, there have been some changes. In fact, changes which happened under Mr. Putin. The media has been slowly, gradually silenced. That's one of the features of current Russia. Under Mr. Putin, who belongs to the old school, in his mentality. It was, by the way, Mr. Putin who said, and it's in public domain, he said, the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the demise of the collapse of the USSR. He is nostalgic about the old days because he comes from there and he brought with him the guys from the service. Well, let me tell you, it's not a secret. From, the figures differ, but up to 70% of current government employees in senior positions in Russia are former, either KGB officers or guys who performed special services for the KGB. Well, of course, Mr. Medvedev, the current, he's called by the British, not me, lapdog, that's not my term, lapdog. He was not in the service. And he was provide legal services for the KGB. And but he was never an officer. But he had 17 years of friendship and business relationship with Mr. Putin, who at some point, some of you may remember, on the this wave of Yeltsin's reforms, some new people, individuals, literally, guys, remarkable, appeared. Well, they're all dead now. One of them was Anatoly Sobchak, the mayor of St. Petersburg, one of the original reformers, liberals. And I was very friendly with the guy, and he would ask me, Oleg, do you know someone in the KGB I could trust? I said, listen, I'm sorry, but I do not know anyone who you could trust politically, because don't forget, we belong to a different school. Well, he picked up Putin because Putin was his student when Sobchak was professor of law at the Leningrad State University. Well, Putin was his student, and he invited him to serve through the mayor's office. And at some point, he became chief of overseas operations in the mayor's office. A famous program, now totally silenced, though documents exist, again, in public domain. There was a great program initiated by Mr. Sobchak, and Mr. Putin, as his deputy, was involved in the so-called oil for food program. We sold a lot of oil at that time to Western companies, and the food arrived too. But it did not reach the, people who really needed it most. It would be all grabbed by huge, guys who were new proprietors who emerged as a new class of Russian tycoons. They used that food program to enrich themselves. And that's what made Mr. Putin, in a sense, a reliable guy. In fact, in the 90s, there was a criminal case against the mayor's office, including Mr. Putin, about the criminal investigation of their misuse of that food for oil program. Well, as you know, Mr. Sobchak unexpectedly died, at a very tender age of 50 or something, and all the guys who were in one way or another involved, including, Mrs. Starovoytova, who was on that special investigation task. She was just gunned down in '98. So nothing came out of that investigation. Well, that's an introduction to what has been happening ever since. As I mentioned earlier, the old guys came back. Not the brutal killers of Stalin's era. Oh, not at all. I say they would not even use psychiatric institutions anymore. I mean, that's so outdated. I mean, kind of Gorbachev's era. These guys found more effective ways, and one of them is using Western methods. If you do not agree with your bosses, you are fired. And if you try to find a job, you will not be, helped by anyone. That's the Western way, in a sense, you know. Economic pressure. I mean, the destitution of economic rights and using this so-called privatized economy, which is, by the way, essentially run by the old gang. Well, let me tell you, in the old USSR, there were three pillars of the Soviet society. Number one, the Russian Soviet Communist Party. Number two, the KGB. Number three, the military-industrial complex. These were the three pillars of the former system. Well, with the collapse of the USSR, three new pillars appeared. Number one, the government, composed of the former primarily KGB guys. Second, business people who cannot make business unless they collaborate with the KGB. And third, criminals. So this is another three pillars of the society. I mean, government, business, and criminals. All a fusion of these three elements. That's what is Russia today. Incidentally, this is not my invention. I attend often some lectures by American specialists in Russia, and I choose what I find more correct in my view, because I'm following Russian events closely, and that's exactly what happened. Russia has abandoned the original goals of, democracy, Western style. No, Russia is a very special country. Don't forget, it's between Asia and Europe. Europe is kind of rotten or rotting. China, well, that's a big deal, but America, well, that's by the way, even in Russian, approach to America, it still remains adversary number one, as I mentioned earlier. Who is number two, by the way? You'd be surprised. Georgia. No, Georgia. The Republic of Georgia. Number three, Ukraine. Well, this is according to the Financial Times. They conducted some, this latest, but Financial Times has its, they use Levada Center. Some of you may know some of these public relations and centers. Well, number one friend for Russia today, you would be probably surprised, probably not, Belarus. Belarus is the most trusted friend, and Mr. Lukashenko is the best guy, most reliable. Well, of course, I mentioned the United States as number one, Georgia number two, Ukraine number three, okay. China, by the way, oh yeah, for the Russians, as I said, number one good country is Belarus. Number two, incidentally, is China. China, then Germany, and then Armenia for some reason. Well, that's okay. I mean, but not in the first five. Well, this is what the public opinion says today. And what we have been witnessing over the last 8 years is a slow degradation of democracy in Russia. In terms of words, well, it's democracy, but it's a special democracy. As I mentioned earlier, something superior. You probably, some of you may have seen the Russian youth movement called Nashi. Well, in the old days it was called Komsomol, Young Communist League. Nashi, or this group emerged on the political scene just in the last 2 or 3 years. You know who they remind me of? Putin Jugend. Doesn't it sound familiar? Well, Hitler Jugend, Putin Jugend, because they are ardent supporters of the current regime, and they are willing to go the whole hog to, remove all the obstacles. They are potentially fascists. Let me quote someone, a great guy who I have had the highest respect for, and I really admire the man. The name, I'm sure, familiar to you, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the oldest experts on Russian affairs. I have been following his analysis and for decades, literally, since he appeared on the public scene. But I picked up that from his book, when 17 years ago. Can you imagine? In 1991, that's correct. 17 years ago, time flies. In his book called Out of Control, Mr. Brzezinski wrote, and I quote from the book, danger in Russia is unlikely to manifest itself in the shape of resurrected communism, but rather a new form of fascism. Communism is practically dead. Well, the Communist Party of Russia, it's, nothing. Old veterans, with all respect, they have no chance to come back to power. That's too obvious. But so he says, danger is not in the resurrection of communism, but rather in the new form of fascism. Fascism is particularly effective in exploiting the irrational side of human nature, appealing effectively to emotions that can be galvanized through special means, through praise, national glory, through discipline. Russian variant of fascism is unlikely to be quite as far as Nazism with its unique racial obsessions. Unlike communism or Nazism, Russian fascism would express itself through authoritarianism rather than totalitarianism, through chauvinism rather than ideology, and through statism, or the state appraisal of state, rather than collectivism. It would be fascism in practice. The combination of dictatorial role, state domination, even if a partially privatized economy, chauvinism, and emphasis on imperial myths and missions. Well, some of you may disagree. Okay, I may also have some questions because Russia is on the move. It hasn't finished its cycle, historic cycle, but it's a fact that after Yeltsin's anarchy, after Gorbachev's lack of decision-making, resolve, we entered the time when the guys who belong to the old school, but again, as I say, not as criminal, not as vicious as before, they are running the country. Now, one thing which characterizes the current Russian regime is the emergence of a, political party, which is not equal to the Communist Party of the old days, but it's called United Russia. It's a combination of amorphous political forces who vote yes for the current regime. Incidentally, Joseph Stalin at one point said, and I remember his words well, they apply to any country, in fact. He said, it's not a matter of how many votes you get during the elections. It's a matter of who counts the votes. Well, that's a kind of a problem which Russia has been facing. Well, in the recent elections on the regional level, I recall in one province of Russia, the number of voters was twice as many as the number of residents. They made some miscalculations, There were 2,000 registered votes. When they started counting the votes, there were 4,000 something, That was a minor scandal. The people filed complaints in court, but the Russian court, oh, come on, crazy guys. Forget about it. One of the ways to avoid the true facts is to silence them. And that's what happened to the Russian media. There's practically, except Novaya Gazeta, some of you may have heard, the only liberal, Anna Politkovskaya worked for that newspaper, Yuri Shekochyhin worked for that newspaper, they are all dead. This is a newspaper with nearly 40,000, circulation weekly. So, that does not reach the masses of the Russians. Russians are glued to television like most Americans are. But on television programs, they see the same stuff, Here you could switch on to some programs, which may be Fox Channel, which would castigate the White House or whoever, Obama and Clinton and vice versa. And, better than I do. But in Russia, it's all, television is essentially speaks in one voice. That's of the pro-government. And a lot of Western shows just to make the people feel that they belong to the Western world, Some of the cheapest Hollywood stuff, That's what you could see in Russia. And people love it, and as long as they live better, and that's very important. I started with that. They forget about it. Well, after all, we live better. Well, we live better, but there are some sad figures, too, which I would probably, I'll remember that anyway. Russia is today #1 in alcoholic consumption. 16 liters of alcohol per capita, just one. In the United States, it's 8 liters. It's annual calculation. Of course, kids are included. So twice as much as in the United States. The number of people who are destitute is 1/3 of the nation. And yet, despite that fact, some of them feel a little better off, as I told you in the beginning, from $80 a month to $600 a month. Of course, inflation has been rampant. It's about 10%, annual growth. Well, the new president promised he will take care of inflation. Well, probably he will. But one of the things which you must understand, and I'm sure most of you know, the success behind Russian economic revival. Huge oil prices. When you pay, $1.45 per gallon from compared to, 90 cents when I came to the United States years ago. You know what it means? That means that Russia has become an energy empire. And that's the definition, again, has been made and maintained. Russia thrives on this, huge natural resources. They managed to win over some of the European nations through this natural gas and oil programs. The French, the Italians, the Germans, they would not quarrel with Russia because they will be, Poland tried to, or Ukraine. At some point, they lost Russian supplies of natural gas. Russians immediately charged Ukraine prices which were 3 times more than the regular ones. When Ukraine protested, they said, that's the world prices. We are just treating you like an equal member of the world. What do you want to preferential treatment, Well, when Mr. Yushchenko did not behave, the current president, he was poisoned. It was just sheer luck that the man survived. The poison used ricin, or dioxin, that's in the same group, more or less produced by Laboratory 117, which used to exist in my days in Moscow. It's now called the Institute of some problems under the auspices of the security services. They tried ricin, dioxin. A number of people who were killed. Yushchenko survived. When this guy, former KGB lieutenant colonel, actually colonel, later, Mr. Litvinenko, became an outspoken critic of Mr. Putin. Personal, vicious attacks. I never met Mr. Litvinenko, but I was on regular telephone, conversations, and I would receive his articles he would publish and distribute through internet weekly columns related to current Russian developments. And as I read his stuff, I called him once and said, listen, Sasha Alexander, you may be in trouble. You do not understand who you are dealing with. I said, I know Putin, he's good for nothing. I said, okay, but he's president of Russia. He has under control everything. You should not play games with he's the head of state. He has pride, he has dignity. If you hurt him too much, you may, he would not listen. Another piece I read, 2 pieces which really led to his death. That's in my view, and people who are, following the whole story. He published 2 pieces before he died. One was called the Kremlin Chikatilo. Well, those of you who know Russian, that was a mass murderer in Russia. So the Kremlin mass murderer. Litvinenko wrote about Putin's involvement in the Chechen conflict. He also was one of the co-authors of the book, the KGB, or FSB, which is the current name of the KGB, blows up apartment houses, remember, in Moscow, which led to the invasion by the Russians of the Chechens. The Chechens were fingered as the culprits. Well, Litvinenko and some other guys, a historian, Goldfarb, who lives now in New York, he's a little nervous to go back home. They wrote a very well-documented book which said that's not true. The apartment houses bombed in Moscow, in the low-income areas. They were that was a device by the Russian elite at that time to justify the military involvement in Chechnya. Well, so that's what Litvinenko wrote about. But his final piece, oh boy, that was something terrible. Well, I do not know if I should use this forum. But he talked about, I'll put it not as a title, but he talked about President Putin's alleged sexual deviations. And that piece was distributed across internet. When I read this piece, I thought, Sasha, oh boy, you are exactly, that happened. So many people do not know, but well, if you read the Russian media, you'll find that, I mean, internet or otherwise. My book, the second edition, the first edition was published in the United States and in English in 95, right? 94, I'm sorry. In 94, it will be, well, reissued with 3 more chapters with a new epilogue and some details, including some of the stuff I've been talking to you about, including Sasha Litvinenko's My Conversations, including those episodes. Well, I'm not sure that when this is all going to be in print that I'll be treated well, but, well, we'll see. Well, that's something which characterizes the current Russian regime, to gag the media, to gag the free expression, to remove, if necessary, by physical force, the critics of the current regime. Well, compared to Stalin's times, when millions died, literally, well, that's nothing. Come on, we have crime rate in the United States higher than in any country in the world. So, what? Well, there is a difference. Yeah, political assassinations has become, in Russia, part of the political scene. Well, the other thing which characterizes Russia, as I said earlier, is this privatization. Privatization of huge government, I mean state-owned property. That led to the wave of corruption in Russia. And the whole system has become so intertwined into corrupt businesses that that's what is part of the pillars, as I mentioned earlier. Corrupt business, corrupt government officials living on, you know what, if you do not share some of your profit from a private company with some clerk in the government, I mean local, municipal or higher, well, they will not issue a license. Well, they will find ways to send the tax police to check if you are paying taxes correctly. That's a very, you know, very, well, I would say, civilized way. Instead of putting in jail or psychiatric institution, send the tax police, send the tax inspectors. And that's what the current Russian regime learned well. And it works. People are, you know, fearful. They would rather collaborate with the government or their representative rather than, well, get out of business. So that's the private enterprise. Okay. Now, let's go to the judicial system. Well, it's really, you may have heard, for those who know Russian, Basmanny Sud. This is the court of justice, which is characterized by the presence of the executive power. Judiciary is not independent in Russia. It's independent on paper. In fact, it reminds me of the old days when I was a number 2 man in Leningrad's St. Petersburg KGB office. Well, in my own way, I had a justification, moral, let's put it this way. But in terms of legality, it was totally illegal. I'll just remind you of this case, which is now part of the Russian system. The mayor of St. Petersburg at one point, and then the leader of the party was a guy by name Zykov Lev. He replaced Romanov, who died a couple of weeks ago, the former chief of St. Petersburg. Zykov was in corruption too, but his wife, and we investigated some stuff, KGB, and Zykov's wife once calls a guy who was under investigation and tells him, listen, you better clean your papers because the KGB is after you. And we picked up that telephone call, and what do? I order the KGB officers to arrest that guy immediately, and I call the judge. You'll say, oh, what? And I call the judge and say, give this guy, a maximum. Well, he could get up to 7 years or 3 or 4, or, on parole. That was the Soviet legality. A KGB officer, senior, would call the judge and say, give him 7 years in jail. And the judge would never disobey. That was the system. That's precisely what has been happening lately. Again, the judiciary system has been, subordinated to the executive power. And that's one of the problems of Russia. Journalism gagged, the judicial power is essentially put under control, and what's left? Well, of course, the Russian parliament, legislature. Well, I was a member of the Supreme Soviet. We could challenge the people. That would probably have no... Andrei Sakharov was the man of courage who challenged the Soviet system publicly for the first time. And he had a few followers later. As you know, Sakharov died of, heart attack, but you never know. Could be real, could be, But he paved the way to many Russian political figures to challenge the system and insist the Russian parliament at that time was fairly free, probably ineffectual, right? Probably a lot of talk, and yet we could speak our minds and we could do something to legislate some new reforms in the country. Today, the Russian parliament is just, yes, sir, just like the former Supreme Soviet of the USSR under Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. If there are any dissenters, they would be taken care of. The Russian parliament today is essentially a part of the executive power. It's lost its independence. And that's what in some gives you a view. The media gagged, the judicial power is subordinated to the executive, and the power of parliament has been essentially reduced to just a yes vote for That's what we have today in Russia. But as I said, special treatment of dissidents, unlike Stalin's mass murders, this is what characterizes the current regime. Well, Mr. Medvedev, fortunately, is not been known for any association with the KGB bad, anything. But he provided, as I said earlier, legal services for Mr. Putin, for Mr. Sobchak and others who at some point were accused of or investigated on corruption charges. So as a legal, advisor, lawyer, he did very well. And he is now in charge. He's in power. Well, what do you think? Well, what I think of him? Well, I'm an optimist in a sense. This guy is better educated. He has no background of the KGB like Putin or, some of his friends. But he is not an independent guy these days. I use the word lapdog. It's not my invention. But in many ways, he is a kind of a man who would not do anything until he, entrenches himself in power. And I'm not sure he'll be capable of being a truly independent guy with the prime minister, so-called Putin,